let's get on with our presentations. Our first panel truly needs no introduction. We have the dynamic duo of Jenny O'Brien and Kim Otte. Jenny has been a fabulous ambassador for compliance for many years. She serves on the board. She's a past president of HCCA, and she's the current chief compliance officer at UnitedHealthcare. Kim Otte, many of you will recognize her from a recent edition of Compliance Today. She graced our cover. She is the current Chief Compliance Officer at the Mayo Clinic, and they are going to share their views on how best to influence decision making. So let's give them a round of applause, and we look forward to their presentation.
Thank you very much, Sarah Kay. Well, good morning, everyone. Full transparency is that the promise of sunshine is really how Roy Snell convinced two of us from Minnesota to come and present at the conference. So as I look outside and see the clouds and the rain, I think there's been a bit of a bait and switch. What do you think, Kim?
We're out of here.
But we'll continue to push forward. This morning, Kim and I want to challenge you to think about your role and the skill of influence. We're not going to talk about HIPAA audits, obligations to disclose, Medicare repayments, but rather we want you all to think about the characteristics and style that are helpful and impactful in the role of a compliance officer. Clearly, influence is a part of most jobs, but we want to explore today how it's unique in our role as compliance officers. We will share a bit of our journeys. For Kim and I, HCCA has been a big part of our journeys. I think many of you have heard Roy Snell talk about that HCCA is now in its 18th year, and that our compliance profession isn't growing because we have trouble identifying or finding issues, but rather our profession is growing. The problem with the profession is that we have trouble fixing and addressing the issues. Part of what's been missing, or has been missing, is the ability to influence. But as our profession has matured, and with all of your help, we've created more tools and resources. We have more certified in compliance. It was amazing yesterday to see how many people stood up when Debbie Troklas asked how many of you are certified in one of the different areas. And most importantly, more of us are getting a seat at the executive table. The skill set and ability to influence, I believe, has increased because of all these factors. And in the end, it's resulting in us being more effective compliance professionals and us being able to bring more effective compliance programs to our organizations. Kim and I are going to talk about 5 skills, or areas, that are core to influencing and link those up with our jobs as compliance professionals. I have to admit, while we appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk with all of you about influence, we both found this to be a bit of a daunting task. Because like many of you, or all of you in this room, we continue to explore, learn, experiment, sometimes fail, and other times succeed in our ability to be influential up, down, and across our organizations. So let me start by sharing a little bit of my journey. My journey started in 2001 when I first interviewed for a compliance role. I had been an assistant attorney general for about 5 years and was asked to come meet with someone and learn about a role at a large integrated healthcare system. So I went and met with the chief compliance officer, had lunch, sat and listened, and I was intrigued, but at the end when he finished his spiel, I said, gosh, that was great. But until we had lunch just now, I didn't know there were 7 elements to a compliance program. You can probably find a better candidate. Probably not a great career. I've changed my answer now. How many years later I'd answer that a little bit differently. But and he said to me, which is fortunate he didn't end the conversation right there, or I probably wouldn't be standing here today. But he said to me, Jenny, I can teach you the 7 elements of a compliance program. I need someone in the organization who can, and he used these words, who can influence. So I, continued the conversation. I said, well, tell me what that looks like. What do you mean by influencing? What does influencing as a compliance professional look like? And he said, I need someone who has a courage of conviction, who can be a role model and lead with integrity. I need someone who can build relationships and is interested in building relationships across the organization. I need someone who's a strong communicator, both written and verbal, but who really understands the balance of listening versus talking. He said, I need someone who's a life learner, who's interested in always learning new things, being strategic, creative, innovative. And finally, I need someone who's objective and level-headed, non-judgmental, calm. What I don't need is someone who's going to run around the organization like a Chicken Little of the sky is falling, anytime some really big issues come across the desk. So I looked at him and I was intrigued. I said, 13 years later, I remain intrigued, even though I continue to learn, explore, experience. But I remain convinced that the chief compliance officer that I was interviewing with, and some of you may know, it's David Orbuck from Minneapolis, was spot on in identifying one of the core competencies for our roles, which is ability to be influential. Kim, do you want to share your journey?
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks. I too find myself very intrigued by this profession. I much more recently journeyed into this compliance profession. Certainly familiar with the subject matter and familiar with the leadership role, but I still sometimes feel like in this profession I'm watching, and that's okay. I think that's why Roy paired Jenny and I up. I have a little bit of a new perspective on this, and you'll hear that coming through today. I still have a little bit of that awe of watching. And you'll hear that come through in some of my comments today by comparison and contrast with as Jenny and I look at these skills of influencing. So I'm pleased to be here. There's a lot of us to watch today, so I've had a lot of observation and a lot of immersion in this profession at these conferences. I come at this from a health law perspective. I've always practiced health law. I love health law. If I can do anything related to health law, it's far more interesting than a refrigerator contract because there's always that ethics component to it. So I practiced health law for about 20 years. I was in private practice. I went in-house at a large HMO, and then about 12 years ago, went in-house at Mayo Clinic. Spent 10 years in the lawyer role, and then 2 years ago, transitioned to the chief compliance officer role. So many of you may know Greg Warner was my predecessor. And about 2 years ago, when he was contemplating retiring, he kind of ran it by me. He kind of tested, so, what would you think about this compliance officer role? And I too said, I not on my radar, not on my career plan. And he talked with me a couple more times, and he sold me. He sold me on two things that both have panned out. One was he sold me on the opportunity to influence a company that I love, to influence the future of Mayo Clinic. And then secondly, he sold me that this job links with kind of my original academic passions and interests. So this job really brings me full circle back to some original academic interests I had in philosophy and bioethics. And as Jenny and I were talking these past few months getting ready for this, it really made me think so much about that. It was almost about 20 years ago to the month that I was working on a master's thesis in philosophy. I was going to be a professor and get a PhD in philosophy. So I was working on a thesis titled The Ethics of a Bioethicist, and my intent was to have a thesis that argued that every hospital should have an ethicist. Name on the door, ethicist. And by the time I finished the paper, the thesis, I concluded completely the opposite, that while a hospital should have a really strong ethics program, I was really hesitant to say there should be this named ethicist. So here I find myself back at a very similar door 20 years later, because that's the door I'm just drawn to in my professional life. So I've been our compliance and integrity chief compliance officer for about 2 years now, and in many ways it's the same table. I'm in a different seat at the same table as I was at as an in-house attorney, but it is a very, very different seat. Now, how is it so different? As I was thinking about what are those main points, it's more ambiguous. This is an odd job we all have. And I'm still getting used to that. It is just ambiguous, but that's the glory and the horror of the job. The scope of this job is so incredibly broad. Most days we all deal with billing and compliance issues, HIPAA, conflict of interest. But a couple weeks ago, I came home and I was thinking, I got a call today on cockroaches, malware, and pornography. That's a broad scope. And fitting the cockroaches issue into the 7 elements of an effective compliance program, that was tough. But I often say in the past couple of years, it is a broad scope. Again, coming from that lawyer seat at that table to the compliance professional seat at that table, I have so often said, you know, state and federal law are easy. It's Mayo law that'll kill you. And that is really what our job is combining that law, that policy, the values, the ethics of our corporations. So let's transition to our topic today. We will pay off the dancing pig, I promise. Let's transition to talking about influence. Jenny and I had a lot of great conversations, and we bucketed the skills. The job of a compliance officer is not just about what we can do, but what we should do. I've heard that many times these past couple days, and I think that is really what it boils down to. That is influence. The compliance officer role is entirely about what we should do going forward, as opposed to what we in our companies do at the defense table. That is all about influence. And I would also just note, before we kind of dive into these areas, that the compliance officer role, I recognize, will be very different at different companies, depending on the resources, your staff, depending on the culture of the company. I can only imagine, because I've only been at one place, but I do recognize that it would be very different at different companies. However, in any event, I'm confident that it requires influence. So what are the influencing skills that make a compliance officer effective? That's what we're going to focus on today. In its simplest terms, influence is the ability to motivate someone to think or act in a way that you want them to. And again, what should we do, not just what can we do? We've bucketed this into 5 themes that we'll talk through today. Collaboration, communication, modeling, measure, and credibility. We'll explore each of these themes, giving some of our own ideas and responses to them. As we met and prepared for this, we learned so much talking to each other, comparing and contrasting our experiences and our perception of the role. We decided today what we're going to really try and do as we go through these is focus less on platitudes and more on examples, life experiences, observations of how we've seen these skills influence an effective compliance officer. Also, just as we get going here, just to manage expectations, we'll go through these five skills, and we do get faster as we go. So let's start with collaboration. Collaboration. How is collaboration important to the influence of an effective compliance officer? Couple points. As I met with my new boss after transitioning from legal to the compliance role, I asked her lots of questions about how can I help you? What do you expect of our team? What is our job within Mayo Clinic? And she finally summed it up by saying, Kim, you are now the pig at the table. That's the dancing pig. You are now the pig at the table. And I kind of looked at her puzzled, and she went on to explain, you're the pig at the table and not the chicken. The chicken comes to the table, offers the egg, offers the memo, the analysis, the statement of the problem, and can walk away from the table. The pig has to come to the table, bring the bacon, and stay. That's the difference between being a lawyer and a compliance officer, I think. The compliance officer must stay at the table and help design and actually implement a sustainable solution. Collaboration requires knowing the business. One of the more helpful books that I have read is Influencer by Patterson and Guinea. Has anybody else read that book? It's kind of one of those motivational books. It's the same authors that did Crucial Conversations, but I think for a compliance officer, it is spot on with respect to our skill of influence. This book takes a number of examples of really complex problems that have been solved with simple solutions. What the book does is it claims you need to look for vital behaviors to figure out what motivates a change. One of the examples, or in particular, it talks about the eradication of the Guinea worm. Now, the Guinea worm is a parasite that has inflicted villages in North Africa and Asia. And the Guinea worm gets in your body, grows to be about 1 meter long, and then burrows out of your body very slowly. It's extremely painful, and the researchers who were trying to solve this through the Carter Center looked for, there were some villages where there was a big guinea worm problem and some where there wasn't. And the researchers tried to look at the behaviors in those two villages and say, what were the vital behaviors that led to such vastly different incidences of the guinea worm. And when they looked at these two villages, they found two vital behaviors, or many villages, compared the villages, they found two vital behaviors that were at the core, the root cause. In the villages that did not have a big guinea worm incidence, they did two things. The women who gathered the water poured the water through their skirt and filtered the guinea worm larva out of the water. And then secondly, in the villages where they didn't have a big guinea worm problem, the leaders were aware of who was excreting a guinea worm, and they had peer accountability. Those people weren't allowed to get back to the water, because when what you want to do when the guinea worm is coming out is put your limb in cold water, which immediately triggers the guinea worm to release eggs, and the cycle continues. So these researchers discovered these two vital behaviors, and by extending those behaviors to the other villages, in 26 years, they've nearly eradicated the guinea worm from millions of incidents to 100 and some last year. So my point in this extensive story about a guinea worm, we actually had to debate if we put a dancing pig or a guinea worm on our cover slide. We went with the dancing pig. But my point is, I have thought of that guinea worm story so often in the past couple of years, because we all have guinea worms every day. What are the vital behaviors? When we were thinking about a privacy problem, and we look at hospitals, some have a lot of breaches, some don't. What are those vital behaviors? Without asking for more resources or a big technological influx, what are the vital behaviors that we can use to influence different outcomes? That's really what this book focuses on. So I would highly recommend that book. Again, the title is Influencer. Many of the examples in that book talk about using the resources and the existing leverage points we all have to influence change and to solve a problem. So again, I thought Mr. Josephson yesterday was right on. One example of how I feel like we've been successful in that is having our compliance program partner very closely with our ethics and professionalism program. We've done, whenever I have the opportunity, I do co-education of new employees, residents. I co-educate with the Office of Professionalism. Anytime we do a communication, we really try and start out the first paragraph linking to our values, not the law. In our annual education, I had a lot of positive comments back that people are much more motivated by our values than they are by some bullet point list of the HIPAA provisions. Finally, another point related to collaboration and that skill for influencing is collaboration requires that we assume benign intent. We often end up as compliance officers with an allegation or an investigation that, despite our best efforts, ends up in the gray zone. Now, we cannot ignore a problem or be naive, but I increasingly default to this assumption of assuming benign intent when we are in this gray zone. For example, in privacy, we've worked with HR. I've seen an evolution over the past couple of years to distinguish between risky behavior and reckless behavior, and to realize that sometimes in the gray zone, risky behavior deserves coaching and reckless behavior deserves discipline. That has been a good skill for collaboration, to assume benign intent. There are just too many times when it takes too many resources and too much of a toll on collaboration to be right. More important to assume benign intent, collaborate, than to be right. So those were kind of our thoughts on collaboration. Jenny, your additional thoughts or response to that?
Sure. I'm just picturing all of you thinking we're both from the Midwest and we have chickens and pigs and cows sitting at our executive tables, right?
And guinea worms.
And guinea worms. Yeah, it's really fun there. So the last bullet on here is let the other person have your way. And a couple years ago, I was Googling and looking for different things about persuading and influencing, because I was, quite frankly, feeling I was very ineffective in my influencing on an issue, and was looking for a different way to approach it. And this quote came up that is, the secret is to always let the other person have your way. And that really resonated with me of the work that we do as compliance professionals, because when I came into this role, I was told right away, this job isn't about you. It's about the organization and all of the business partners being successful. And it's my job to help them do that. And when they're successful, you sit and you celebrate and you say, great job. And again, one of the harder parts of this job is when they're not, quite often it comes around right away to say, well, why didn't compliance find that sooner or do that sooner? And you just have to let that roll off your back. So the secret is to always let the other person have your way. And when we were talking about collaboration, Kim and I made each other tell stories. Well, what do you mean by that? And the story I shared was one where we had a group of our ambulance. We have 4 ambulance barns in the Twin Cities. And we were having trouble making sure the medications were locked in the barn. And I had 2 options as a way to get this fixed. One was option A, where I could write a memo from the chief compliance officer. I'd go to the VP and say, thou shalt fix this issue, make sure the medications are locked. We're going to come in, we're going to audit, and you know what? If we find out and we validate it's not fixed, we're going to have to escalate the issue. And I had tried that in other issues and weighed the risks of what the issue was and thought, I'm going to approach this a different way. So I took option B, and that was to take time to sit back and figure out what were the barriers? Why were they not able to get the medication boxes locked consistently? So, and I wanted to work with them, to have the solution come from them. So I called up the VP and said, hey, I'd like to do an ambulance ride along. Would that be okay? And he said, sure. And so I picked a time that wasn't convenient to me, but was a time where I knew I'd see where a lot of, really see what it was like to do their job. So I picked from midnight to 6 a.m. on a Saturday night in January. It was like 0 degrees out. But that was, so they, first of all, were shocked I showed up. They're like, I'm sure they kind of did an over-under on whether I'd really show up at midnight. But I did. I showed up, and I did what we always have to do, right? I brought treats. Big box of treats, and they were kind of all sitting there, and then like, oh, she brought food, and slowly kind of went up to the box. The VP knew why I was there, but I didn't say anything to anybody else. I'm sure he told the other ones why I was there, but I spent the night with them, or into the early morning. And what I learned from them, and the whole time I focused on how I can figure out what's in their world and collaborate with them, not anything about, I didn't even mention the medication lockbox. So what I learned as I left there at 6 a.m. was they are always on the move. They are never in the same place. There are 4 ambulance barns in the Twin Cities, and the crews rotate in and out of all 4 barns depending on what's happening that night, because they have to be situated in certain parts of the Twin Cities, so they're each of them are only so far away from certain highways and certain high-risk areas. Their first priority is access to the medications and getting there quickly so that they can take care of their patients and what happens. I also learned, there was no evidence of risk of drug diversion, or the meds were being counted, the numbers were matching at the end. And so some could say, well, gosh, weren't you worried you needed to do something a little bit sooner? So it was a really great experience for me to learn a little bit about their world. I returned later to department meeting. It was about 2 weeks later, and I was actually invited to the meeting. And when I came into the room, it was amazing. They were sitting there, and they already had ideas that they couldn't wait to share with me of how they thought they could fix this problem. They did ask, can we have a little time, can we roll it out in one of our ambulance barns before we do it everywhere and make the change? And I said, absolutely. So they did. Their idea worked great. And in a short order, we had it rolled out across the whole system. And so when you look at key takeaways from that, to me, it's really all about collaboration, partnerships, knowing your customer, investing and walking in their shoes, in their world, in their time, spending time part of their day, and engaging them to come up with a solution. They embraced it. And the result of that was the solution was actually a sustainable fix rather than a non-sustainable one that we'd come back 6 or 8 months later and find that the issue was still going on. So that was a very valuable exercise for me, and it was a learning when I had done option A other times and kept having to restart it, and instead take the time to move to the option B and find a sustainable fix for the organization.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks. So collaboration may be more about working together than being right.
Right.
Let's talk about communication. Of course, that's one of the 5, right? And when we bucketed our examples, this was another big bucket. How is communication important to our influence? This is, as it turns out, a really high EQ job. This job requires a ton of people skills. How many of you have taken the kind of short Myers-Briggs color test? I I'm 100% green, so there's a lot of days in this job where I just want to go back to my office, shut the door, and analyze the Medicare regs. That's what I was born for. And this job is really teaching me to be a little blue. It takes a lot of blue in this job. This job requires communication, up, down, and across. When I first transitioned to this role, I went to one of those intensive one-week courses in leadership, and I tried to be really open to it and spend a week admiring my weaknesses. And I came back after a week, and I had a $5,000 Post-it, actually, which I still have on my computer that simply says FYI. That's really what I learned as I reflected on this new role and my weaknesses and what I needed to handicap myself for. It is that communication. After each email or each meeting, at the end of each day, I have to really consciously think, who needs to know this information? Who needs to know it first? Who's not going to like it and needs private notice? And then finally, who needs to tell them? It may not always be me. It may be my medical director partner. It may be a different leader. But that kind of conscious thinking about communication is, I'm sure as all of you are aware, so important to our jobs. Secondly, market the 7 elements. We've heard a lot of discussion about the 7 elements, and it's not rocket science. But I know that many people in our organizations do not understand what a compliance program really is about. I'm embarrassed to say I really didn't. I was your attorney for 10 years. I worked with you every day. I really didn't get the 7 elements of a compliance program. We need to market that. Those 7 elements really help our leadership, our managers and directors understand how to create a program rather than a checklist. Communicate and educate consistently using these 7 elements. First, it helps our own teams articulate what our job is and what our priorities are. It helps others in our organization understand what our job is. And most importantly, maybe, it helps others to truly make compliance a part of their jobs. The program is so much more important than the checklist, which is what I think a lot of people think compliance is. Finally, on communication, keep it simple, stupid. There are 2 kinds of people in this world, simplifiers and complicators. We really need to be simplifiers. What are we asking our audience to do, and what do they need to know to do that? A couple tools that we've used that I would put in the short list is, and there's different mnemonic devices, we've started to use institution-wide at Mayo an S-bar. So it's just a format for teeing up an issue, situation, background, analysis, recommendation. We use that within our department and then throughout the organization. This has been so helpful for clarity in communication. In order to get a topic on an agenda or any materials with the agenda need to be in this format. Many of my team members are here and they're going to laugh. I love pictures, Venn diagrams, risk continuums. I think those tools are so effective for simply communicating the complex issues that we often have to help our institutions navigate. For example, we recently used a Venn diagram to frame a discussion about our roles versus the quality personnel role in the labs. We are currently working on reevaluating our gift policy, for example. And we are working on a risk continuum that we will use to frame that discussion. So, for example, I love to use the arc, kind of the half arc, and on one end put the clearly okay, on the other end put the clearly not okay. And then plot 6, 8, or 10 points in between that and use that in a meeting to help analyze where do we want to draw those lines, where do we want our policy to fall. Those kinds of tools I have found to be particularly effective in this job. Finally, it is simple but effective to say please and thank you. As I've listened to and observed our team, this habit is very defining. Start with please and end with thank you. It doesn't mean you're a pushover in your role. It just means you're an effective communicator. Jenny, other thoughts on this one?
Great. Well, thanks, Kim. So the last bullet talks about control the tone. direct the conversation. And I have, as I go through the day, I kind of talk to myself. Do any of you talk to yourself throughout the day? Sometimes I talk to both of me. But I sit there, I'm like, control what you can control. And there's a lot we can't control. One of the things that I've been really working on, and so as Kim and I shared, we are still learning and exploring and experimenting to see how we can be more effective and be more influential. And so I'm always looking around the organization to see who is influential and who is successful in influencing in the organization. And then I watch them very closely to see what they've done and how they carried that out. So I'm going to share a story that recently occurred with my organization. It's something I'm now experimenting with and actually finding some success with. But it's where I witnessed influence and leadership through an intentional communication strategy that seemed effortless. And it really resulted in a better outcome on a really difficult discussion. So when it comes to the intentional effort to set an appropriate tone in a meeting, and work to do it in an open and positive manner. We bring a lot of bad news to our organizations. When I come in and meet with people, my whole goal early on is to get to know people a little bit earlier, so when I come in, you don't get that roll of the eyes and like, oh, she's here again. So really work on setting up the right tone. And in this situation, we had a meeting where we were going to be talking about some really difficult things. You can pick the topic, but let's say it's budget cutting or reduction in force of what we had to do as an organization. And when I entered the room, you looked across the room and the group was quiet. Arms were crossed and battle positions drawn. And turf lines, everyone had their turf lines and they were ready for their argument of not my team, I've already given. And this leader entered last, which was intentional, entered last and ignored it. He ignored the mood, he ignored the negative tone, sat down, hit the table and said, I'm going to start this meeting a little bit differently. My son just came home and talked about his first day of kindergarten, and I thought, wouldn't it be great to hear what people's first day of kindergarten was like? And the group was kind of taken aback, like, what do you mean we're going to talk about this? And so he goes, go ahead. And the first person went and they said, oh, I loved the first day of kindergarten, but I fell asleep on the bus. And I never made it home. My parents had to call the police, and they found me in the bus barn, asleep in the back seat. And everyone was like, oh my gosh, and laughing. Another person raised their hand and said, I wet my pants. And I tried to hide it all day long. And people were, kind of looking and laughing. And then someone else said, I remember the artwork I did. And it's still hanging in my parents' hallway every time I go home. So this went on. It only took 5 to 7 minutes. These were really quick stories. But it was amazing what happened to the mood in that room before we were going to start this difficult discussion. Arms became unfolded. The mood slowly shifted in the whole room. And when the time came to talk about what was the big item on the agenda, we accomplished it in short order. We accomplished it more collaboratively. We reached a better outcome, and everybody felt they had a voice at the table because they had shared something. Now, this isn't something you do with every discussion, but I've had a few really difficult compliance discussions where I know people are, when I come in, they're just waiting. But if you can disarm it and change the tone, control the tone, direct the conversation early on, it's still going to be a difficult compliance discussion. It was still a difficult business discussion, but we got to a better, more open result for the organization because it wasn't everybody in their silos. We had all opened up, and it really became about what's better for the organization. So some lessons learned from that is I really am working on knowing and making sure that I can read the audience and then plan accordingly. So that's where I talk about strategic outreach or a really strategic, intentional communication strategy. We need to have the ability to change language, tone, and pitch to whomever we're talking to. So if I'm talking to a chief medical officer, they think one way. If I'm talking to the chief informational officer, their mind works an entirely different way. And everyone has different interests, right? If I'm talking to the CEO or the general counsel, so I go in and may talk about the same topic with 5 different messages in a way that I'm hoping might resonate in their world, not come to them on what I think might resonate in mine. So, Kim, should we move on to modeling? All right, so with modeling, what do we mean by modeling? The simple truth is, as compliance professionals, we are evaluated by what we do, how we look, what we say, and how we say it. Leadership counts, and we have a long leadership shadow. And what do I mean by a leadership shadow? People are watching us, and even though we don't know they are, and they're watching to how we're going to react to things, respond to things, and in many ways, they want us to be championing some of these behaviors because that's what they want to see in our leaders. I learned this early on in my career when I entered one of our rural hospitals, and as I came into the door, I saw this big puddle off to the side. I don't know if it was Diet Coke or if it was some coffee that had been spilled. And I went into the information desk and said to the person, is someone coming to clean that up? And she was busy, and she said, oh, yep, we'll get to it soon. We're just really busy right now, and went back to what she was doing. So I said, well, excuse me, is there a mop or anything nearby? And she just pointed to a closet. So I went to that closet, pulled out a mop, cleaned it up. Again, it just took a few minutes, put everything away, and I went on to my meeting. Didn't think twice about it. When I say leadership counts in a long leadership shadow, it was amazing. This story of what I did spread throughout the small hospital and even made it to our corporate office, where it was used as an example of living our values, demonstrating and living the values of the organization about putting patients and families and employees first. I have to admit, I was shocked. I'm sure you all do things like this each and every day, but it's just a good reminder that people are watching us. And I didn't clean that spill up because I wanted somebody to see I was doing it or some reaction to it. I cleaned it up simply because it was the right thing to do, and I pictured someone coming in and slipping, or one of our employees slipping and falling. I didn't connect at all at that time that was an action that would help me be perceived as more effective or influential as a leader in the organization. However, as small as that action seems, it was ultimately that helped me be a more influential leader with that organization and with the team in that building. So some of the takeaways that, it's the small things matter. I always say that with my team. It's not the big things, it's the little things that we do that matter. And as role models, like it or not, we are under more scrutiny than others in our roles as compliance officers because we're seen as the promoters of the code of conduct. We're seeing the leaders in ethical behavior. The ability to influence is not a one-time event, and it's not something we can only focus on occasionally or even something we want to do only when we're in the mood to do it or want to do it. It's really something that we can't separate away from being what we do in our normal life. So how well and effective we are, I believe, at influencing is directly related to how we act all the time. And our employees are watching us and the leadership's watching us, and I just think we have a really great opportunity to move up in the influencing circle and demonstrate to our organizations, what it looks like to do the right thing.
So that's great. I've already blown it in my job. I had never had a speeding or parking ticket in my life. And then the second week in this job, in a corporate car, I got a speeding ticket. So this circle, Jenny and I had some great conversations about this. This circle, frankly, makes me a little uncomfortable. So I'm going to kind of stay scripted so I don't really offend all of us.
We did have great discussions, if you can imagine. It was we had a good time putting this together.
I'm still trying to sort this piece out. I think we have to be careful to not be perceived as doing our job from some sort of moral high ground. Now, what do I mean by that? At my first HCCA conference a couple years ago, and again, I'm transitioning from a lawyer role to a compliance role. I kind of go immerse myself in an HCCA conference. There were 2,800 or so compliance professionals in Las Vegas. Now, that in and of itself is a little disorienting. So during this first conference, I found that a clip from an old Rice Krispies commercial kept going through my head. You know, the one where the mom comes out of the kitchen and stands in the doorway and wipes her forehead? You know that one I'm talking about? She's got flour all over herself. I don't think we want to convey the feeling that we are somehow the last ones in the organization tirelessly fighting for the good. I think that can feel more personal than professional. And it can even, I think, or I suspect, be a little professionally isolating or off-putting rather than influencing. So again, what am I trying to articulate here? I think a good leader has to exercise all 5 of the influencing skills we're talking about. And we as compliance professionals certainly don't say we have any kind of corner on the market on collaboration or communication. Similarly, all good leaders need to model the values of the organization. And I think that's all we really mean to say when we're talking about this. It's easy to become indignant in this role. I recall watching my predecessor, Greg Warner, really deftly navigate not getting backed into this corner. He would come to the table, expressly link the debate to the law, Mayo policy, Mayo values, the Mayo brand, and he would make all employees aware of and accountable to these principles. He might in the end take a different interpretation or have a different vote, but it always felt more professional than personal. He knew when to let it go, and he treated it like a professional opinion, not kind of a religious conviction. I think we professionally want to be the pig at the table and work on facilitating the 7 elements of an effective compliance program. I think we want to avoid projecting ourselves or being perceived to kind of be that Rice Krispies martyr mom. I want to help sustain and create a compliant and an ethical culture. But I guess I'm a little hesitant to take on the conscience of the organization. So that's the best I can do to articulate that reaction.
No, I think Kim's right. I mean, it is a fine balance of doing that, and I think that's why moving on to our next circle of measure really fits with this. You know, the word we have up on the screen is measure, or measured. And in my story at the beginning of this, the word that I used when interviewing for my first compliance officer role, when they described some of the skill set or attributes that were helpful, was objective, level-headed. The word I like to use is simply poker face. I think as a compliance officer or being on a compliance staff, one of the things, it's so important that we just are level. You know, I have the poker face when all of these crazy things, whether it's cockroaches, pornography, and malware, along with a low billing issue, come across our desk during a day. In our roles, we never know what's going to be on the other end of that phone, what's going to be in an email, and what's going to be when someone knocks on the door and comes by. The one thing I do know is quite often, and this is the good part of our job, it's usually not as bad as people initially make it during that first phone call, so that's good news. But sometimes it is, and if it is, we need to be ready for that as well. So that's why I come into each interaction I have with a very intentional, and I think you've heard me say intentional, so and a number of times today, but it is because I am practicing and have to think about these things to try to get to effective and influencing. But I come to these interactions very intentional, starting at the point of curiosity. I don't know if people have heard about mood elevators and you start at one place and move up or down, but curiosity is right in the middle. So I sometimes have to force myself to say, remember, you're supposed to be in the middle. Start at curiosity, because you kind of dive down on that elevator and get into judgmental and some other things. So I stay at curiosity, and whenever anything comes across, I work really hard to not react. So for example, you know, someone came by the other day and said, Jenny, I just heard of a big problem where we have agents and brokers who are cheating on their tests. We've heard that their secretaries are taking their tests for them. Well, in my company, we have 25,000 agents and brokers, and we are going to have some bad eggs in that. But, you know, and inside I'm thinking, oh my gosh, if that's true, what's that going to mean? And we have, you know, the selling season coming up, and is it widespread? But instead, you know, stay very measured, and it's, thanks for telling me, let's start at the beginning. And so I could go on, many of us have many, many examples, but I work very hard to stay at the level of curiosity when these issues come forward. With each of these, don't get me wrong, there is absolutely a sense of urgency, and don't think that I don't go to one of my colleagues' offices after that and you know, 5 minutes later and stick my head in the office and say, oh, can you believe that just happened? I mean, you know, emotionally we have to do these things. And then I have one of my compliance colleagues, Shirley Quall, who we've started a few meetings where we look at each other and we just laugh. It's this crazy, unsettling laugh, and then say, all right, are we ready to talk about this now? Not yet. And we have to laugh a little bit longer and say, can you believe that happened? And then we go into work mode. But in our roles, we don't learn anything from joining in the swirl. I have a sign on my office that when you walk out, it's not that big, it says stop the swirl. And so people, they kind of pause as they go out. That's our job, is to stop the swirl. If we lead with angst, or if we make all these premature assumptions and go all the way down the rabbit hole as to how bad this can be, or simply panic, everybody around us, including our business leaders, are going to do the same thing. So I really focus with my team and myself on being objective and just sticking to the facts. You know, this is a really isolating job that we have, and I'm lucky I have a team. I know many of you out there are on your own or wearing 2 or 3 different hats, and we have a tendency to load things down onto our shoulders because we make these issues ours. And I keep telling my team and others is, we just are collecting the facts. We didn't create this awful situation. We have an obligation to help fix it and help get the organization in a better place. But don't go home at night and carrying all that baggage on your back. It's our job to have things come in, weigh us down a little bit, and then figure out who we lift it out to and who we get it to help be partners and to our business partners to help solve the problem. Another thing I really focus on is role clarity to stay measured. Because you are also good at what you do, people are going to keep bringing you things. Because you're doers, you're responsive, and you make sure that an issue gets tied up and closed off. Because of that, other things will be brought to you. So when that happens, I always ask someone, who's the business owner? And they usually can name one. If they can't, right away you know that's one of the issues, right? No one's owning it. And I'll say, well, let's take that to Mark together and help figure that out. I easily could take that on. But if I do, then I'm going outside the scope of what my job is, and we all have enough work to do and really have to focus and maintain on role clarity and speak only in the voice of compliance officer, and don't start talking as a chief sales officer, even though I could answer that question, the chief financial officer, the medical officer. Have them bring people to them and let them use their voice, and then they also take some business accountability and ownership with it. Kim?
So just a couple things on measure. Triple C. Triple C is actually what we used to call Twyla, my mom. Calm, cool, and collected. You just couldn't get a rise out of her. And I think that's what we're talking about with this influencing skill. Jenny talked about the corporate churn. Just a couple quick observations as I was thinking about this skill. What are some of the examples of things that show this skill or that have been successful? I think we can really help in identifying a lead in these crises. I'm sure at your shop, similar to ours, we tend to engage too many people too many times a day often. And one thing we've been able to do is really help with our crisis management policy, our crisis management, to identify leads and help manage that communication. Another observation, keep people updated. Beware of reporting up too early, and beware, of course, of reporting up too late. I tend to err on the side of waiting. I don't need all the facts to report up, but the facts I do send up have to be absolutely final before you start reporting those out. I'll share with you one saying that I always carry with me. A wise lobbyist I worked with at Alina once told me, if you don't know what to do, do nothing. And that's not really in a lot of our type A oldest child DNA, but I have found that to be a very helpful thing to think about in terms of measure. Why don't we turn to the skill of credibility? Credibility and rigor. How does credibility and rigor contribute to our influence? Influence does not mean BS, not that kind of blue. A compliance professional we have to use motivation, persuasion, but not BS. Our lawyers, our leaders have to know they can send us into a room with an investigator or an attorney and that we're not going to fudge on the facts. We, of course, need to be competent in the law, competent in the facts, in order to earn that credibility. We have to be able to really clearly explain the reasons behind the law, behind the policy, behind the decision. And I constantly am reminding myself and our team and others in the institution actually to be really honest about what the source of that law or policy or decision is. We can lose credibility if we overuse the law or if we're not clear on that rationale behind our decisions. Tools of rigor. Another tool that I think has been really good for credibility and rigor of our office is the tools of rigor. It is just not sufficient to be earnest in this job. Now, we are an earnest bunch. But a few months ago, I knew I had not been effective. I had had a very difficult conversation with another leader, a number of Sunday morning phone calls, where we had a disagreement about staffing an investigation from a conflict perspective. And we had some difficult conversations, and on Monday, found ourselves in a meeting, and he pulled me aside and he said, let's talk about this again. You were just so earnest. Now, earnest is not my end goal in this job. Earnest did, in this case, get me one more discussion, but it didn't seal the deal on what needed to happen. Use risk language. We've talked a little bit in some of the other sessions about enterprise risk management, metrics, trends, dashboards. I think these formal tools of risk management are great tools for us in terms of credibility and rigor. What they can do is help us and help our organizations prioritize, put in an order, what order we're going to turn the rocks over, and tell us which are the biggest rocks. Where do we want to start? It helps the list not to look as infinite to our audience. Dashboards and metrics help us to track risk and performance. Now, we at Mayo, like many of you, we're relatively new to this kind of rigor, the ERM, the dashboards. But we're getting better at it, and I think it is a great tool for credibility and rigor. I think one of the important challenges for our profession in the coming years is going to be to prove up why we're doing better this year than a year ago. And I think increasingly our institutions are going to require us to kind of prove that. Be judicious with authority, guard your independence. I think if you ask our leaders, our board members, the independence is what they're often going to say they're looking to us for. So be careful who enlists you for what purposes. Some of the advice I got when I first took this job was be careful about thinking out loud. So that all goes with our role of independence. And Jenny, this is so much fun. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and keep us going here.
All right, thanks, Kim. So just a few things to add on credibility and why credibility is important and what gives one credibility. There may be a number of you here who were also sitting in the audience a few years ago, and a question was asked to Odell Guyton on the panel of, what is it that you think's something that a compliance officer can do to be more effective and be more influential? And Odell answered with 2 words, and I have carried those 2 words with me ever since that conference, and it was, be relevant. Be relevant in every interaction with your organization. And by that, being relevant sometimes means having the courage to speak up when you aren't comfortable speaking up or are shy to speak up. But it also means to also know when to not say anything and not speak up, which goes a little bit to that those beginning comments about understanding the balance of listening versus talking. A couple other things that gives credibility, and I think Kim's right. Our leaders, senior leaders, we have to remember their job is bigger than just compliance. We're actually, I think of my role as one to try to keep it off his or her desk so they can worry about the other things that the CFO is bringing, the CIO is bringing, the chief medical officer, all of these other things that the CEO has on their plate or on their table. And so I want them to look at us to see that we can bring complex issues and have the ability to connect the dots and articulate simple, clear steps that will mitigate the risks that we're sharing with them. So a couple other ways to do that is what we've talked about, knowing the business, knowing the challenges, knowing the opportunities. I do work around the table. A couple years ago, one of my professional goals was to be seen at the table as more than just a compliance officer. Now that's not inconsistent with overstepping my role, but I had earned a seat at that table, and I wanted to be seen to be able to help the organization beyond just a compliance strategy. Have a little humility. I think that is a huge part of our business. Admit it when we're wrong, because we are wrong, and also admit it when we don't know the answer. We will get them the answer, but make sure we admit it when we don't know the answer, and that brings us a lot of credibility. And as Kim said at the beginning, always say please and thank you at the end. So now we want to thank all of you for sharing your time with us today. We started the session talking about our personal journeys. We shared our experiences, our stories, and how we continue to evolve in our roles as compliance officers. Before we end, we'd like to share some thoughts from Roy Snell, on the CEO of ACCA and SCCE, on how you are all influencing beyond our roles in our compliance programs and the impact we are having as a compliance profession on a broader scale within our industries and within our organizations.
Kim Otte asked me a very interesting question, and that is what influence do compliance professionals have beyond the management of a compliance program? What does the industry collectively do to influence change elsewhere? And I think the compliance profession and the thousands of compliance professionals have had great influence on three areas. One is healthcare leadership. Healthcare leadership now takes the compliance profession, the role of the compliance officer, and the function of the compliance program more seriously because of the tireless work of the compliance professionals in our industry. The second area that I think they've had some influence on is the enforcement community. I think the enforcement community, when I got started as a compliance officer 18 years ago, came into an investigation with an entirely different attitude than they do now. I think now the enforcement community takes into consideration the fact that healthcare has been working on this for many years, compliance professionals have been working on this for many years, and that there are many organizations that deserve a great deal of respect and need to be sent maybe less of a message than they did 18 years ago because of the work of the compliance professionals. And third, I think that compliance professionals have had an impact on the regulatory environment. Regulations are often created because of mistakes that are made in a particular industry. And because compliance professionals over the last 18 years, thousands of individuals have prevented thousands of problems that they have prevented the issues that would have created the atmosphere for more regulations in healthcare. I think that the influence of the compliance profession collectively over the last 18 years has made a significant difference well beyond the individual's organization.
And with that, here is to all of you, to Dancing Pigs, and to another 18 years of influence. Thank you.